I want you to imagine that you've just been teleported or apparated, warped, whatever you want to call it, and you now find yourself in front of a train track. And you notice that there's a train barreling out of control headed towards 5 people who are tied down to the tracks. You don't know who these 5 people are or how they got tied to the tracks, but this train is going out of control. There's no conductor. If it's allowed to continue, it's going to hit those 5 people and kill them. Now, you also notice that there's a lever right next to you. And if you pull this lever, that train that's going out of control is going to be diverted onto a second track. But on that second track is one person that's tied down to the tracks. So now all of a sudden you have a decision to make. Are you going to allow that train to continue on its path and hit 5 people? Or are you going to pull the lever and divert the train onto the second track where it would only kill 1? So do you let it kill 5? Or do you pull the lever and then thereby allow it to kill 1? So go ahead and think about it. Did you make a decision? Okay, good. You just got warped or teleported or apparated yet again, and you now find yourself in front of another train track. And there's another train going out of control. There's no conductor, there's no one seemingly steering or driving the train, and it's headed out of control towards 5 people that are tied down on the tracks. But this time, you notice that there's an extremely fat person standing right next to you. And you just know that if you push this fat person hard enough, they're going to land on the tracks, and that train is going to hit the fat person, probably kill him or her. We don't want to be discriminatory on this podcast. And it would save the 5 people, though. So would you be willing to push a fat person, basically kill that person in order to save 5? Would you kill 1 to save 5? What would you do? Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what does any of these bizarre situations or scenarios have anything to do with everyday life or history? In this episode, I'll make the argument that it has quite a lot to do with both of those things. So going back to scenario 1, it turns out that close to 80 or 90% of the population, just an average population, would choose to pull the lever. So if the train was going out of control towards 5 people, but you could pull a lever and make it only hit 1, most people feel like that's the right thing to do. But in the second scenario, that number goes down a lot because a lot of people are uncomfortable pushing somebody on in front of the tracks or basically actively killing someone in order to save somebody else, even if there's more people being saved. The percentages are much closer to 50-50 as far as who would push the fat man and who wouldn't. Probably the most famous example of a trolley problem in world history is the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. In mid-1945, World War II was already barreling down the tracks towards destruction by no fault of the United States government, or at least limited fault of the United States government, and an opportunity was presented to the government where they could drop an atomic bomb on innocent Japanese civilians, killing hundreds of thousands of people. If they didn't use this new atomic weapon, the U.S. would be forced to risk a ground invasion which could potentially cost the lives of millions of people, United States and Japanese soldiers and civilians included. And by the way, I am fully aware that there's a ton of other factors that went into this decision, stuff like the firebombing that was already going on, potential intervention from the Soviet Union, all sorts of geopolitical considerations to take into account. But in my experience, this kind of simple version of The trolley problem is what is most prevalent in the public discourse and what is most debated as far as what actually gets talked about with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs. So there it is. Would you intervene in order to save the lives of millions? Would you intervene by pushing the fat man and dropping a bomb that would kill tens or hundreds of thousands of people in order to save the millions? Ironically, one of those bombs was named Fat Man. To me at least, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, probably the two most prevalent and discussed potential trolley problems that you'll hear in the historical realm. But there were plenty of other prominent trolley problems, even those associated with World War II. Take, for example, this particular case. I'll let Sarah Bakewell from an old New York Times article describe it. Quote, in 1944, new German V-1 rockets started pounding the southern suburbs of London, though they were clearly aimed at more central areas. The British not only let the Germans think the rockets were on target, but used double agents to feed them information suggesting they should adjust their aim even farther south. The government deliberately placed southern suburbanites in danger, but one scientific advisor whose own family lived in South London estimated that some 10,000 lives were saved as a result. End quote. So a much lesser trolley problem from World War I, the Germans are launching bombs into England. Do you divert those bombs to hit a lesser number of people who would otherwise be completely unaffected? Or do you allow them to continue on their normal course without interfering? So now that we start to understand the practical application of the trolley problem in the real world, we can see it in all sorts of places. Strategic bombing, drone strikes, terrorist attacks, the use of torture and the debate around torture. Is it right to torture or possibly even kill one in order to save many more than that? A sneaky one that's under the radar, look at the healthcare debate in the United States right now. Many people on one side of the aisle would argue that we have a train barreling out of control down the tracks. We're spending too much money on healthcare. It's eating up too much resources. And in the long run, we kind of have to streamline the process, or many, many, many people are going to get hurt over the course of time. And it's going to be a huge number. But in order to do that, in order to streamline that process, we're going to have to divert the tracks and all of a sudden change the healthcare policies and impact people, maybe tens of millions of people, 20, 30 million people who otherwise wouldn't have been affected if the government does nothing. Maybe a bit of a stretch with that example, but my point is you can see these kind of trolley problems popping up throughout not only history, but also current events. And ultimately, how you look at these two separate trolley problems and how to solve them has an impact on just a plethora of modern real-world issues and how you view historical issues as well. Let's now take a look at some of the possible solutions to these trolley problems, at least in my eyes. So the first thing I think most people will ask when you tell them this trolley problem, and maybe some of you are thinking this as well, is who are the people on the tracks? Many people will ask, is that my family member on the tracks? Is that my friend? Who's on the trolley? Now, for the sake of the, philosophical point you're trying to make, usually you try and keep those people anonymous. But you can't keep people anonymous in history or in the real world. So for the sake of history, of course it matters who's on the track. Our family, our friends, our countrymen, the specific people on the tracks make a difference. This leads to what I'm calling the team-based solution. So these people don't particularly care about the numbers. So it doesn't matter if we're going to save one person or 5 people. I'm not too concerned with that. I'm going to side with whoever's on my team. So whether that's my country, my family, my friends, my political group, whatever. If one of the 5 people tied down on the tracks is on my team, then of course I'm going to divert the tracks and I'm going to let it hit that one. But if there's nobody on my team that's tied down with the 5, and the one person that's tied down on the separate track is on my team, I'm just going to do nothing and let it hit the 5 people and protect my teammate. I think there's a couple of problems with this team-based solution. One of them being that there doesn't really seem to be any thought process behind why you're making the decisions that you're making. It's just whoever's on my team, I'm going to help, but there's really nothing underlying why your team should be helped versus somebody else's team. And taking these kind of ideas to the logical extreme, this could lead to a lot of just tribalism and just some things that aren't going to be productive for a healthy society. Furthermore, it seems like the numbers should matter, at least to a certain extent. I mean, if you can save 5 people as opposed to just saving 1, that's 4 more people in the world that are now able to be happy and able to be, producing positivity and, all the things that make life good. So, all else being equal, 5 happy people is better than 1 happy person. And of course, this leads us to the second possible solution, at least as I see it. And I'll call this one simple utilitarianism. So the idea of utilitarianism is that you're basically trying to just maximize the total amount of happiness for the most number of people. So it's simple because it just becomes a numbers game to figure out what to do in these types of situations. You should always save the most number of people that you can. Going back to the first scenario, the simple utilitarian would pull the lever because you're saving 5 people as opposed to just 1. And in scenario 2, the simple utilitarian would push the fat person because, you know what, yes, I am killing him, but I'm also saving 5, and that's a bigger number than 1, so there's more kind of happiness and pleasure in the world because of it. The advantage of this numbers game type of view is that it's relatively simple and it kind of applies across the board, so you don't have to do a lot of thinking. But the drawback of it is that there doesn't seem to be any values or principles behind the reasoning that you're reasoning through. When you push the fat man onto the tracks, you're basically saying that the principle that you're adhering to is that it is okay to sacrifice 1 to save many. Do we really want to live in a society where this is true? Do we want to live in a place where at any moment anybody can be pulled out of their daily lives and sacrificed for the greater good? Well, let me give you an example. Little Johnny is going to visit his grandma in the hospital, and it just so happens that at this hospital, there's a doctor performing surgery on 5 patients, and these 5 patients all need new healthy organs, and they need them very quickly within the next few minutes or they're going to die. So the doctor decides, you know what, it's for the greater good, I'm going to save 5 people, and as soon as little Johnny walks in the door here, I'm going to abduct him, I'm going to harvest his organs, and I'm going to use those to save the 5 people. I think most people would find this pretty horrific, and it illustrates the point of, do we really want to live in a world where these kind of historical and ethical decisions are just made based on numbers? So that would be my problem with the numbers game solution number 2. And I would like to point out that there are much more complicated versions of utilitarianism and consequentialism that kind of take those factors that we talked about into account. But again, I'm just talking about for the purposes of what you're going to hear in the common discourse about these historical events in their relation to the trolley problem. You're probably going to get this appeal to the numbers game. This brings us to the last solution that I have to offer, which I think is the best solution, and it's called positive and negative rights. So according to this viewpoint, everybody has negative rights and everybody has positive rights. A negative right is your right not to be interfered with. So it's kind of like that old John Locke stuff of life, liberty, and property, the pursuit of happiness, all that stuff. If I want to go walk down the street and go get delicious Chipotle, I certainly have the right to do that as long as I'm not harming or interfering with anyone else. And I should have the right not to be interfered with when I go about my just kind of daily business. In addition to negative rights, everybody, according to this viewpoint, would also have positive rights. So a positive right is a right to a good or a service. Many people see social welfare as a positive right People have the right to be helped by others if it is relatively, inexpensive and easy to do. Many people see healthcare as a positive right because it is the government or some other entity bestowing that right, bestowing that service upon somebody else. So I see negative rights as your right not to be interfered with by anyone, and I see positive rights as your right to be helped by people when you need it. So imagine you made it to Chipotle, you want to get that burrito, and you notice this little kid, little Johnny, is being just an annoying little tool, and you just have this urge, this desire to go put little Johnny in his place and maybe throw him around a little bit, show him what's good. Now, you can't really do this because the problem is that little Johnny has a negative right not to be interfered with. And as you're sitting there eating your burrito, stewing over this negative right stuff, you start to realize that little Johnny is choking. And of course, he has a positive right to your assistance. So if you know the Heimlich maneuver, of course you would go up and perform it and problem solved. But what if you didn't get up to help him? Could it be said that you killed him? I don't think so. I think that would be too strong. So this brings us to the point of negative rights are stronger than positive rights. And it takes much more to kind of overturn a negative right than it does to overrule a positive right. So in the example there, in the first scenario, if you got up and, wanted to show little Johnny what was up and tossed him around and, inflicted violence on him, you'd probably get arrested because you violated his negative right, and negative rights are pretty strong. If you interfere with those, it's seen as something that is immoral, and it is. But imagine if you decided to not help him when he was choking. He had a positive right to be helped, but you know what? You saw that maybe someone else could do it, or you didn't think you had the training to do it, so you decided not to help him. I don't think anyone would come to arrest you for not helping. Now, does that mean you're totally, in the clear morally? Absolutely not. But the point is that negative rights are stronger than positive rights. The reason they're stronger is that when you violate a negative right, you are the one responsible. You're the one who set that course into motion. If you violate a positive right, it's only choosing not to intervene. You weren't the one that started the scenario in the first place. So what does this have to do with the trolley problem? Well, let's get back to it. So the first scenario, 5 people are tied up on the tracks. You can divert the train back to a separate track that only has 1 person. So according to this viewpoint, I would say you pull the lever because you're in a scenario that you didn't cause. You didn't start the train going out of control. You didn't tie these people down. But you now have 5 people who have positive rights, and you have 1 person who has positive rights. So the positive rights of the 5 outweigh the positive rights of the 1, so you would have to pull the lever, and that's your solution to the first scenario. Now the second scenario is different. It would say that you can't push the fat man onto the tracks to save the 5, because by pushing the fat man, you're now initiating a series of events. You're now violating that person's negative right to just go about his day and, live his life. So the negative rights of the fat man trump the positive rights of the people kind of stranded on the tracks, and that's why you make your decision not to push the fat man. I think the positive and negative right solution to the problem is probably the best of the ones I've mentioned so far, but even that's not without its drawbacks. For example, is there a point where positive rights overturn negative rights? So how many people does it take to put on the track before you would push the fat man? It's relatively easy not to do it when there's only 5 people on the tracks, but what if there was 10? What if there was 100? Okay, what if there was 10 million? It seems like at a certain point, the decision gets harder and harder, and there's a certain point where positive rights overrule negative rights. And it seems like it would be just arbitrary to figure out where that line would be, so that's a very difficult discussion to have. A lot of people do not find trolley problems like this very persuading or very useful because they don't see it as particularly practical. I tried to point to some examples in history that show that it absolutely can be practical, But to me, really the importance of the trolley problems is not the practicality of it. It's important that it shows that you need to have values and principles behind the ethical decisions that you're making. So whatever one of the solutions you pick, or maybe you come up with your own solution, you need to have reasoning and thought behind it. Otherwise, you're just kind of like a robot making decisions without really thinking. And I think the trolley problem can force you to kind of confront some of these different ideas and make you elaborate on your own thoughts. That being said, what are the principles that you base your decisions on? Do your own personal values impact the way that you view historical and modern events? What's the reasoning behind it? Good questions to think about. That does it for Reflection Show number 2. I hope I didn't confuse anybody too much or just kind of mumble about things. It's kind of difficult to go over these thought experiments without looking at a diagram in podcast form. So I did my best. But anyway, as always, thanks for listening. If you agreed or disagreed, I'm sure there's plenty of people who disagreed with some of the stuff I was saying on this particular episode. Shoot me an email, reflectinghistory@gmail.com. You can also search me on Twitter. Otherwise, if you enjoyed the episode, found it useful in any way, shape, or form, be sure to write a review on iTunes, subscribe, tell a friend, all of those things. And until next time, that's it for me.